Thank you very much, and I have had the pleasure of working with various faculty and the Teaching and Learning Center here on at least a half a dozen research projects, so it's a real honor to be here. I also have a nephew and a goddaughter who graduated from Western, and they had good things to say, so another good reason to be here. And of course, as was mentioned, this summer I just taught my 74th post-secondary course. I've taught college, university, graduate, online, on-site. So I'm very interested in the challenges that teachers face, whether they're full-time or part-time, and how to integrate technology and so forth. So part of what I'll be talking about today is also based on what I've seen as an instructor in the classroom and what I see and hear from students, current students, recent graduates, people who are looking for jobs. And I'll be talking a little bit about this whole controversy, the debate that's going on now about to what extent a credential should be tied to the labor market. But I want to start by identifying the various faces of being a higher education faculty member. My parents were immigrants with no post-secondary education, so they never really understood what being a professor meant. So I like to portray it to them as something like this: all the students in class, at the front of the room, paying attention, not using laptops or iPhones or so forth. Now, I tend to like to see myself personally in this kind of light. They're all practiced, they practice outside, they put in hours so that when they come to class, they become fine-tuned experts in their own area. My students, on the other hand, and I'll show you evidence of this later, I think believe I am. And what I actually do, and what I just did this past weekend, the number of Saturday nights, the number of holidays, the numbers of parties you miss because you have to finish your grading, and the number of creative ways you find to procrastinate or to reward yourself. So if you grade 5 papers, you can go and have a snack or watch a half-hour of TV. So I've been through it for years. I feel your pain. Now I want to talk about the other side of who I am and what I do, and that's HEQCO. For some of you who are not familiar with it, HEQCO stands for Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And the debate about what quality means continues. We talk about it all the time. What is quality in higher education? The beauty of my job is that not only do I get to teach, and not only do I get to go out and meet faculty and students, I get to talk with colleagues about that very question. What is it that I'm supposed to be doing in my class as a teacher? What is it that we're supposed to be doing in our colleges and universities in terms of preparing students for what and in what way? So we were a creation of the Ray Review in 2005, and we were created to be an independent agency. And part of that independence comes from the fact that our office is located separately from the ministry on the lakefront. And you know what they say in real estate, it's all about location, location, location. So we are an independent agency, and we do research on all aspects of higher education. We also look at apprenticeship. More recently, we started looking at graduate education, private career colleges, and so forth. And the primary importance of what we do is that we're trying to use evidence and collect data where there isn't already data being collected. Now, many of our current projects focus on teaching and learning as well. So we finished 17 different projects that looked at student service initiatives of various types. And more recently, we launched, and we're now starting to get final reports on a number of projects that look at how faculty deal with the challenge of teaching in large classes. We also have about 13 or 14 projects on technology-enhanced learning, various ways that faculty are using technology in the classroom. Professional development, and that's, again, where we've partnered with Western, looking at various ways that are being used to teach both teaching assistants and new faculty some of the methods and approaches to be more effective teachers. We've also more recently launched a number of reports, and more will be coming out in the fall, that relate to graduate studies and the challenges that students are facing coming into graduate programs, the NESI survey instrument and what its limitations are and where it's most useful to be employed. And now we're looking more at also learning outcomes. So we have 3 reports coming out in the fall that are the final stages of projects we've been working on, looking at the collegiate learning assessment as a tool. Can it be used in a Canadian context? A HALO, which is an international OECD-led initiative that looked at engineering, civil engineering programs, and finally tuning, where they've tried to look at how to standardize learning outcomes among both college and university programs. Very interesting work that was done. And what was most interesting is they brought faculty from both colleges and universities together in one room to try to iron out. And they found that they actually had more commonality than many of them expected. And one of my particular interests, work-integrated learning. And Western joined us as a partner. We have 8 universities and 6 colleges that have been working with us for 4.5 years. Last spring, in the spring of 2012, we did a survey of the graduating students from those 8 universities and 6 colleges. This fall is the final stage of the study where we will be doing a follow-up study with those students, looking at what happened to them after they graduated. Did they go on to other programs? Did they find jobs? What were their experiences in the world after graduation? And of those projects that I mentioned, a few that really stood out for me that are going to be of interest, that may be of interest to you. We actually just published one of the reports on hybrid learning and hybrid courses by Sheridan College. Another one will be coming out later this year. Employing peer and self-assessment, so having students assess each other's work as opposed to relying on TAs or faculty. Cooperation versus competition. Do students perform better if they're set against each other individually, or if they're grouped in teams to compete against each other, or if they compete against each other within groups? Very interesting experimental research. Differentiated evaluation, something I've tried in the past, where every student still has to do all of the components of a course, but they can change the weighting, the value. So if they're not as good at writing essays, they can trade off part of the grading value. So they're still being assessed on everything, but they have strengths in different areas. And there's an experiment being done on that, or a research study being done on that at Ottawa, and remedial language training. And it's something I'll talk about again later. We have more and more students coming into our colleges and universities who do not have the required writing skills that they will need to be successful, not just in post-secondary, but in the labor market. And colleges in particular have identified that challenge, and 6 of the colleges are trying to look at what can be done to help those students once they've been identified as having writing challenges. And then finally, e-portfolios to track skills acquisition and development. This is something I find interesting as well, because students have to be reminded that it isn't just the degree that's going to matter when they're going out looking for jobs. There's a lot of other skills that they can be acquiring outside of their classrooms and programs. And the better that they're reminded about it sooner rather than later in their academic career. We've also published a number of monographs that are more directly related to the type of work that you do and that the teaching and learning centers do. So we have this report on teaching in large classes, teaching stream faculty, new faculty orientations, teaching and learning centers, and then this fall we'll be working on 2 projects on professional development for faculty and on part-time instructors. So we do a lot of work in the area, we have a lot of work ongoing, and we hope that you'll find some of it, and some of it that I highlight today, useful to you as well. Now, at this point, I just want to remind you that if you're not clear on anything, or if you want to challenge or add to some of the things I'm saying, please just raise your hand. I don't want to be running through too quickly and then lose people either. So I'm more than happy to have people interject and ask questions or so on along the way. So one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the trends in terms of the ranks of faculty, full-time faculty at Ontario University, they have grown steadily over the years. Now you can see here in the years of funding cuts in the 1990s, and then the recovery finally started with the millennium, and now they're topping off. And my guess is, unfortunately, this is the last year we have data for, but you will see a leveling off. I don't see a large opportunity for growth in terms of hiring of faculty in the coming years. What's interesting, though, is if you break that down by age group, what you'll see is that from this period in the 1990s, the balance stayed pretty well the same. And then here, what you'll see here, this is the year that compulsory retirement was struck down. And what you'll see is the blue line, which is the hiring of the youngest faculty, the newest faculty, soon starts to taper off and decline. And the number of over 65 faculty starts to grow. So there are two things that have happened, in my opinion. One was the recession of 2008 and 9, and increasing tightness of funding available to universities. And the other is that there are more faculty that are electing to remain because now they can remain after retirement or after what used to be the retirement age. And it's becoming a real squeeze. And in fact, we published a paper targeted at doctoral candidates and doctoral students, trying to make them aware that if your hope is an academic career, you have to make sure you have a plan B as well. Because there are growing numbers of students in doctoral programs, and the challenges will be greater, I think, in the coming years for them to find tenure-track positions. Faculty salaries have grown steadily over the past decade. So if you look at all three ranks, and if you compare faculty salaries to other professions, actually university professors do fairly well. It's a good career. I hope most of you know that. And you and our institutions and the province of Ontario have done a remarkable job in terms of preparing people with post-secondary credentials. So if you look at Ontario in comparison, or Canada, this is Canada first, in comparison to all the other countries in the OECD, and if you look at our college and private career college and apprenticeship, so this is all non-university credential holders in the adult population, aged 25 to 64, Canada by far outpaces every other modern industrialized country. When you add university level tertiary education, we are the top of the OECD. While a few countries slightly beat us in terms of university credentials, when you add the two together, Canada has the highest post-secondary credential holding rate in the OECD. And you are in part to be applauded for that. Not solely, but at least in part. If you look at Ontario, many of you may remember that a number of years ago, the Ontario government set a goal of 70% attainment in the adult population. The 2011 census data was just released, so we ran those numbers. Overall, we're now at 64.8% post-secondary attainment in the adult population. But if you look at the two youngest age cohorts, we have already achieved that goal. 70% of adult Ontarians hold some post-secondary credential. So this outpaces, I believe, any other province in Canada and any other state in the United States. So again, there's a lot to be applauded. And if you look at, even despite rising tuition rates, those participation rates have continued to grow. This is participation rates of students as opposed to degree holders in the adult population. If you wanted to understand why colleges are so frustrated with universities, it's because nothing has changed in 15 years. The percentage of students going to college in those youngest age categories, 18, 19, 20, 21, and so on, nothing has really changed. If you look at universities, on the other hand, and you compare 2010 to 15 years earlier, despite rising tuition costs, the participation rate has gone up in all of those youngest age categories. So again, it's a reflection of a real achievement, and Ontario would reflect those numbers. This is national numbers, but Ontario would reflect that. One of the realities is that as a result of that increased access, as a result of the increased participation, which has grown hugely in the past 3 to 4 decades, there is a more varied student population. So this is from a study that was done by some faculty where they looked at whether students, they did a survey of students to see whether they were deep learners or surface learners, whether they had a sense of entitlement. And then what they did is they figured out what percentage of the students would fall into different categories and gave it a label. So I'm going to start at the students you probably enjoy working with the most, and that would be the student scholars. So they identified one group, Group 8, that they considered to be the student scholars. They're there today, they were there 20 years ago, they were there 40 years ago. There are always those students who are the high achievers and the high ambition students, and the inquiring students, and then so on up. Then you get to the halfway point, and you start getting into the relaxed student, the strategist. It always amazes me. Many students are not really good with math or statistics, but they can tell you to the percentage point what the minimum work is they need to do to receive the minimum grade. These are what I call the strategists. Just putting in time. But the ones that really worry me are these. These are the ones who have high expectations with low expectations of what they need to do for that. And I'll be talking about that shortly. So you have to keep in mind when you feel frustrated because you're dealing with some of these, that there are those in the classroom too. And fortunately, in your evaluations and in many other ways, you will always get enough evidence that there are some students there who are there to learn, who are committed to learning, who care, who get something out of you and out of your class. You just have to I keep cards up on my shelf where students contacted me years later. They remind me those days when I'm getting frustrated with some of these, or when I'm getting really negative comments from some of those students. And you just have to do that. It keeps you going. Now, I threw in, over the weekend I was shopping, and I saw this fridge magnet, so I just had to put it up there. Now, I'm not sure if this reflects our growing passion with pets and dogs, or if this is a reflection of our worry about grade inflation. But there certainly is a lot of a sense out there that there is grade inflation happening. But again, to go back to what I just said, there are smart, hardworking students out there. And in fact, HEQCO did a research paper on the on these students, what we call high achievers. So what we did is we looked at applicants to Ontario universities. And what we found is there is a top 1% of applicants who are clearly top 1% and have been, they're there still, they always have been there. And a top 5%. But look at the grades, by the way, going up, right? But these are often the students that we're trying to get in our classrooms and in our institutions and so forth. What really interested me, though, was this one. It's an aside, but look at this. More than 50% of applicants to universities today have over 80% averages. I don't buy it. There used to be something called the Ontario Scholars Program, and I'm dating myself here, but it was if you got over 80%, you got a letter from, I think it was the Member of Parliament, or the MPP, and it meant something. But this kind of grade inflation, to me, it is a reflection of what I would consider to be grade inflation. But it doesn't mean that those students, especially those on the top, are not also very high achievers. And what's interesting is we did a profile then of what these high achieving students, the ones with the high academic grades, or the highest academic grades, tended to look like. And what you'll find is that it's not just about the grades. Many of them, many of the things that make them successful, that make them high achievers, are the things that they also do additional to just getting high grades. So they're often involved in the IB programs, the AP courses, French immersion, and so forth. They're also often involved in student council, athletics, school clubs, working part-time, and so forth. The highest achieving academic students are most likely of all to be doing other things as well. And if you want to know, in my opinion, why many of them get jobs when they graduate, it's because not just they got good marks, but they also were well-rounded, they were doing other things, they were getting other experience. So I believe you will see these students flow through the system and continue to do well. The other thing that was interesting is we looked at independent schools, and what we found was that in Ontario, independent schools, private schools, that some people now are resorting to sending their kids to, tend to really promote looking at out-of-province and even out-of-country programs. So the private schools, you tend to see a greater likelihood that the graduates are going to go elsewhere. But if you look at public high school graduates, for the most part, they stay in province. Even though they have the kinds of grades that they could probably go out of province, and they could get scholarships at some of the best American universities, most of them stay in province. And the other thing that's interesting, and I think you can guess that you may be one of those 5, they go to predominantly five institutions in the province. This is historically and so forth. So Western, without naming an institution, it is possible that Western could be one of those 5. And the other thing that's interesting is then the impact. If you are more selective in the students you take in, whether as a program or as an institution, the likelihood is that you will have higher retention rates as well. So we ran the year 1 to year 2 retention rate against the high school admission average, and what we found, not surprising, was that a fairly nice line formed with Western and Queen's over there, the most selective in terms of their incoming students and also the highest. The one point I would make is that these institutions here are also doing the public good, because as a province, as parents, we want more students to have access. The thing to keep in mind is that many of these institutions, because they are doing that public good of providing the access to students who don't have as high GPAs, often need more resources, or they face more challenge because they have more students who are less academically prepared and a host of other issues. Now, GPA isn't the only thing that goes into retention. I want to keep that clear as well, but it is certainly a factor. And I think it's a reflection also of the variation that is already happening among our institutions. And what does student engagement look like? It was interesting, this past summer I was at a conference where they had a whole bunch of registrars and student service providers together, and we were brainstorming to see what an engaged student looked like. So here are the characteristics that we tended to see in what we would call engaged students. And then here are the behaviors, the actions, which we felt reflected. Actually showing up for class could make a difference. Those are there. Those students are there in every one of our programs, every one of our institutions, and a lot of them. And we can't lose that the days we have frustration over some of the others who are not sure why they're there. They are curious, they have a passion for learning, and I'm going to give you an example of a few of the comments that some of my students have written which to me reflects that passion for learning that they had. And you'll see those comments, I'm sure, on your evaluations as well. And as I mentioned, I've had students who 2 or 3 years later tracked me down, because I was a gypsy scholar for a few years, and they tracked me down and sent me a card to tell me that a course they took with me made a difference to them in terms of their career direction and so forth. Now we go to the other end of the extreme. These are the not so engaged students. So again, I'm going to date myself here. So I'm going to show you a picture of what I think it looked like when I was 8 years old. And my parents had no post-secondary, didn't know English well, but that was very much. And this is what. And what's interesting is this is now carrying into our post-secondary system. I have even heard stories of jobs where people in their 20s, employed at a job, were reprimanded or disciplined, and the parent phoned their supervisor. And I believe it. I do believe it. Last week, I was presenting to the recruiters, the university recruiters, who are about to start a new year of recruitment. And they were telling me some of the stories of them trying to deal with those parents, those very involved parents. It is a challenge, and we tend to refer to them, of course, as helicopter parents. So this is the benign version. And in fact, some of you may be helicopter parents as well. So they're always hovering around, ready to swoop in. That's where the term helicopter comes from, right? Money keeps flowing out of the wallet. There have been 2 studies this summer that show that parents are increasingly jeopardizing their own retirement because of the amount of support they're giving to their kids, and not just during PSE, after PSE as well. Now, there's a new version of the helicopter parent, which I recently heard about, and they're called the Black Hawk parents. Because they come in with guns blazing. And this is sort of what it ends up looking like. Now, I'll give you an example where this creates a problem. Over the years, and this isn't just a recent phenomenon, I've seen a number of cases where I have a student taking one of my courses as an optional course, as an elective. They love history, is what I teach, international relations. And they're not allowed to major in liberal arts programs because their parents are paying all or part of the tuition. And their parents, who may have had some post-secondary experience at some point in their prior lives, feel that they're an expert on both post-secondary and the labor market. If you are one of those parents, I beg you, let your son or daughter take what they have a passion for. Because I can show you all kinds of data that will tell you that history and political science graduates do at least as well, as, if not better, than science graduates, at least at the undergraduate level. But there is a perception out there among many parents that they know the answers for their kids. And it is a challenge that we're facing because it means we have more and more students in our colleges and universities who also, because of the elimination of grade 13, and now the effort to eliminate the victory lap, are being forced in or really encouraged to go in younger and less prepared than was ever the case before, yeah.
I always have a case with people from Ontario saying, oh, it's because grade 13 was eliminated. Every other province, the states in the union, after grade 12, they're off to college.
Yeah, had I been in the province, I wasn't when they did it. I certainly would have strenuously said it's not a bad thing to have had grade 13. I certainly would have encouraged, especially because we do have a different generation of young people. I do think now people are maturing later in life because parents are much more involved in their lives. So I would certainly, had I been here at the time, have encouraged them not to have eliminated grade 13. But you're right, every other province, I don't see why we couldn't have stood out though. I wouldn't have minded had it been a bit different. What's interesting also, now here I'm going to show some American data, but it pretty well reflects what you would see here. The reason I use this is because they actually have done a study over 40 years a longitudinal study, so you can compare it over time. But I'm strongly of the view, and you'll see why, that this data is probably reflective of what you would see had a similar study been done in Canada. So what they found is that satisfaction with higher education is high and grew. And it's always amazing to me, because if you look at surveys of students, like graduate surveys, their satisfaction with their faculty, their program, and so on is high, high, high. If you talk to them individually, outside of a survey, that's not what you hear. So there's a disconnect. This is my favorite, though, and this is why I included it here. Same thing as here. In fact, arguably, they're lower than Canada, because among our university applicants, it's over 50%. My GPA is C or less, has gone down dramatically, and I think that would be reflected here, more than likely, which doesn't make sense. If we've taken more people who were not able to get in before, how can the percentage who are on the mark? It doesn't make sense to me. This is my favorite. How can it make sense when the proportion taking remedial training has gone up? And yet, and this is my other favorite, they're all working hard. So let's look at that. I'm hoping to do a time use study or survey at some point, but one of the more recent studies was done using the Globe and Mail survey. What they found was that even the top students, when you combine their class time and their total time studying, which is the red, weren't doing it as a full-time job. Because most full-time jobs are 37.5 hours, 40 hours a week. So in terms of class time and studying time, even the A students aren't, on average, doing much more, much higher than about 30%. Now that's average. There are some that are doing much more, but that is average. Then if you look at, so what's interesting here is that many parents argue that it's your full-time job. We're going to pay, but it is your full-time job to be a student. Now, another argument I hear is that it's because the students are working, because it's so expensive. Well, there's already a disconnect, because if parents all say they're paying, and students say they're paying, and they say they're getting debt to do it, there's a bit of an issue there. If you look at the percentage of students who are working part-time while studying full-time, more than 50%, and in the case of young men, more than 70%, 65 to 70% are not working part-time jobs. Not. The other thing that's interesting is look who is working much more at part-time jobs. Who are the students who tend to be the strongest? It's the female students. Female students are most likely to come direct entry. They're more likely to finish in a shorter space of time. They're more likely to complete their PSE. And so there's an interesting study to be done there. So now it depends on the program of study. It depends on what location you're in. But on average, in Ontario, and other student surveys, USA surveys and so on, have shown the same thing. The majority of students at any particular time, the majority are not working part-time jobs. On the other hand, a substantial minority are working part-time jobs. And this is, I just saw this article recently. University of Windsor did a study of their students, and what they found was that those students who feel entitled, and again, they're there, you've experienced them. What's interesting is that their sense of what they can expect on the job market is also, these are statements that they agreed with, these same students. So as an employer, I beg you to try to dispel some of these myths. The sooner the better, because some of these students do have unrealistic expectations. I have seen some of that myself as well, because I'm also an employer. We hire regularly at HEQCO, both interns and full-time positions. I've always volunteered for any job competition, so I can see what's going on in terms of job applications. So now I want to do one more thing. I taught a European history course at the university level recently. What I always do is I do a diagnostic test so that I can understand how much of geography the students know. So it's not for grades. I do this the first class. Now I want you to be honest with me. If I show you this map of Europe, if you don't know, it's Europe. And I want you to honestly raise your hands if you think you know where the Atlantic Ocean should go on that map. Okay, in my class of Ontario high school graduates admitted to a university program, more than half did not know where the Atlantic Ocean was. And more than 3/4 did not know where the Mediterranean was. If you want to know that there's a challenge we're facing, there is a challenge we're facing. So here's another example, a little bit more scientific. So this is a college, unnamed, because it doesn't really matter. Most of the other colleges who've let me see the data have similar numbers. Many colleges, because over the years colleges have realized that even after admission, they're finding many of the students aren't ready academically. So they've started to do standardized tests, not to decide whether or not to admit them, because they've already admitted them, but to identify the students who are likely to be at risk and hopefully try to steer them towards resources that will help them. So here's an example of an Ontario college where year over year, more than half of the students could not meet even college English levels. And this is consistent with data from other colleges. Well, actually, that's encouraging because it means in the more recent years, there's fewer students. The other thing, though, is it may be because fewer students are taking the test, because if you add up the totals, it's down to 93 now, and I don't know what's happening there, but it's still hovering at 50% of college-admitted students who can't meet college English. So this is a challenge. It is a challenge that's out there. And again, to draw on my own personal experiences, so the kinds of things that these less engaged students, maybe more entitled students would say about me on the internet, on Rate My Professor. This is my favorite. I am ruining their academic career. That's my favorite. Now, do I seem like an ass to you? So this brings us to the importance of teaching. Now, the lecture, the traditional lecture, has been much maligned of late. And if any of you haven't seen it, you know, there's actually a quote I found recently. Many of you may have seen this, maybe not. But you know what? Good teaching matters. And even lectures can be done well. We don't have to always think that technology is the answer to things. So if you look at a recent survey done by USA, so this is Ontario University students, the students were asked to tell what made a teacher effective. So at the bottom, integrating technology, a prominent researcher in a cutting field. Most undergraduate students don't even know what necessarily their field might be. The ones who want to go to grad school would see it as important. The majority don't. Even doing well, and it's interesting, I am a tough grader. I stick to high standards. I have a 4.2 out of 5 average, even though some students hate my guts. But I still get a 4.2 average because I set high standards, I'm fair about them, students know what they need to do to get the grades. You can do well as an instructor and get good evaluations, even with maintaining standards, and students aren't dumb enough to think that giving easy grades is going to make you more popular or more liked. Clearly outlines expectations. Now, this is where the technology would likely come in. I think there may have been, but I think this is where using PowerPoint, using maybe video or interactive things, these are the two that really interest me, because look at how high they rank with students. Enthusiasm, passion, it makes a huge difference. Interesting and well-prepared and organized lectures. So don't throw lectures out either as a delivery tool. But even lectures are no good if you don't have the passion. My guess is that the fact that you're here at the end of your summer holidays suggests that many of you do care about your subjects, you care about teaching, and if you can project that out to your students, they'll get something out of you, even in a lecture or what could be partially a lecture format. Now, early on when I was at HEQCO, we did a survey of faculty at 6, I think, Ontario universities, and what we found at the time was that for the most part, people hired as professors learned by doing. That's how I learned. I didn't have teaching and learning centers way back when. It wasn't that long ago, but there wasn't as much opportunity. There is a lot more now, but certainly back then, the majority of professors who were surveyed, they learned either by doing themselves and maybe making mistakes and refining over the years, and also by talking with colleagues. There was less use of those tools that are now more and more available. I think you'll see that rising with the new generation. And we also got interested in the whole idea of teaching and learning and research on the topic. And so this book, which came out in January 2010, recommended providing more opportunities to faculty, supporting scholarship and research in the area, and so forth. And many of you, I'm sure, have also seen this report from Don Drummond, which came out just over a year ago. So there's been more and more interest. Most recently, the Auditor General got into the game. And just last November, so not even a year ago, this report Now, this is a statement that I found interesting because I think it's reflective of the popular mood right now. A university's most important mandate is that it does a good job of teaching its students and preparing them for the workforce. So this is the next point I want to talk about, which relates to these news stories that have been circulating the last few days. So again, back to that US survey, which I believe reflects data from Canada. You can see a decline. This is my favorite. The essential to learn to get along with people has been cut in half. But if you look at this, the chief benefit of going is to increase one's earning power and to get skills and training for an occupation. And this isn't just the students on their own coming up with this. This is coming from society, from government, from their parents, and so forth. So there are more and more students who are coming to university specifically or primarily because of this desire, this ambition. But we need to be more honest and open about that issue. I worry, for instance, about these kinds of quotes that AUCC circulates. We should be careful about that. We shouldn't, I don't think, be doing that. But on the other hand, look at the media. Why so many smart, educated, ambitious young people have no future, as if it's a fact. And you can read the Globe and Mail, Maclean's, CBC, The Generation Jobless. If you haven't seen it, check it out. You would think, you would get depressed yourself, even if you weren't in your 20s. So what is the reality? Well, let's do a reality check. This is not the first recession that has happened in Canada. So let's look at the jobless rate of those aged 20 to 24 historically. This is not the worst recession in terms of young youth joblessness. In fact, I graduated here. And even in those incredibly boom times, if you remember them, where you could come out of a college or university credential and almost get any job, there was still unemployment then too. So let's have a reality check. There have been recessions before, and there likely will be again in the future. But let's also look at why this discussion has become so important, especially in Ontario. Because if you look at the Ontario numbers, in the 80s recession, we were lower than the national average. In the 90s recession, we were slightly above, but more or less in line. But in this recession, we have been higher. It's still lower than the previous two. The other thing is, we went through a long period where we didn't have a recession. We used to have them every decade or so. But that is a reality that's facing graduates, yeah.
The other thing is in the 80s and 90s, the proportion of
yes.
people who had post-secondary education was different, and the unemployment rate of graduates was much different.
Yes, and that's the other challenge, is that more of those people who are looking for jobs or can't find jobs have post-secondary credentials now. It is a more competitive market, especially for them.
Because there's more of them.
Yeah.
It's a supply
Yeah.
and demand.
Yeah. And because the prices have gone up, many of them have accumulated debt, more so than might have been the case in the past. So it has become a very public issue. But the thing we have to remind students, and again, this is off a US study, what they did is they looked at two different standardized tests of skills development. One was the Collegiate Learning Assessment, and another one was a study looking at academic growth, academic engagement and growth. So they were essentially trying to measure in two different ways the skills that a student learned when they graduated. So all of these were students with a US bachelor's degree, but they were not equal in terms of their skill set. And if you looked at the students with the lowest skill sets and their unemployment rate, and you looked at the students with the highest skill sets and their unemployment rate, when you earn a degree, and remember, it's earn a degree, not buy a degree, not get a degree, it's earn it. It is not a voucher for a job. It never was, it is not now, it never will be. As an employer, I don't owe you a job because you went to PSC. I want to hire someone who's capable. I'm more likely to look for the green students, as would any employer. Students have to be reminded that if they're gaming the system and learning the minimum to get a credential, they may end up unemployed. But it's not because the job market doesn't employ graduates of PSE. It may be because the job market is looking for graduates of PSE who have skills and abilities. So some closing thoughts. We need to rethink how we measure student success. So we used to focus on access, and we've done an incredible job in the province of providing access to a broad range of students. Then we started to realize that bringing them in is little use if they don't stay. If we do everything to encourage them to come in first year, and then they find out they're not academically ready, they're not emotionally ready, financial resources and so on, it's doing them no favor. So we started to focus more on retention, and in fact a lot of our KPIs are focused on retention and how to maintain retention. But again, retention on its own merit isn't good enough. They need to be retained to graduate with skills, with ability. Now we're jumping over, and now we're worried about employment rates, satisfaction, income, and so on. Well, to me, we have to focus here. Are the students acquiring skills in your classroom, in your program, at your institution? Are they increasing the skills from when they went in to when they leave, when they earn their credential, to be better ready for whatever that future is that they elect to take? We have to be focusing more on that, because ultimately it's they who will or will not find a job, and the credential will only be one tool in their ability to find or not find a job. So some ideas and advice for faculty. Integrate technology, especially where appropriate, but don't assume that technology is always the answer either. Strive to engage students in their own learning. You already have a number of students in almost all of your classes who are engaged. Try to reach out to those other ones who aren't so sure or may not feel so ready. Maintain high standards. Let's not water down what we're offering, what we're expecting of students. When I hear about liberal arts courses that are eliminating the essay, the writing component, the research and writing, it really worries me, because you should be learning to do research and writing. So we have to make sure that rather than giving up in frustration, we figure out ways to work at maintaining standards. But we have to articulate clear learning outcomes. I've used rubrics. There's a lot we can learn from the K-12 system. The more honest and open and clear we are to students about what is expected of them, the better they will be capable of meeting those expectations. Utilize, that's by the same token, a transparent assessment. So if you have a rubric where it's clear what's expected of them, then it's easier for you to grade it, and it's easier for them to understand where they need to improve. Teach the fundamentals, back to what I was talking about earlier. In my case, research and writing, in other disciplines, something else. But when I see people applying for jobs, and it's at least 20 to 25%, most of them have at least 1 or 2 post-secondary credentials, and many of them cannot write a cover letter. That is inexcusable. And if they want to know why they're not getting jobs, I can tell them why. And it has nothing to do with the credential. And pay attention to the other basics. If you give them a deadline, give yourself a deadline to give it back and stick to it. It's not fair to penalize a student for handing it in late and then not only tell them when it's going to come back to them, but give it back to them on time. Plagiarism. If you want to know how bad plagiarism is getting, just think of the fact that 2 German government ministers and the director of education in the largest school system in Canada lost their jobs for plagiarism all the way up to the PhD. I have caught students at the graduate level plagiarizing. It is a serious problem. I'm so glad to hear that this institution is taking it seriously. We cannot ignore it. They will lose their jobs at some point. Someday it will catch up with them. It's better for us to be teaching them some of those basics. I want to leave the last words to students. So this is from the 3M National Teaching Fellowship, where they surveyed students. So this is students talking to you. Which goes back to the passion and the enthusiasm I talked about earlier. Again, passion. If you love it, other people will catch it. It's like a disease, a good disease. And this is really directed at you for being here in an August summer day when you could be at home by your pool or wherever else. You know, you have to keep upping the game. You have to keep trying to learn new things, discover new things, talk to colleagues, the square you were talking about. And finally, a last word from me. So universities are all about, words, the importance of words. And this is an observation I've made. So it isn't a teaching load and a teaching burden. It's not a release. And that's my closing message, and thank you very much for your time, and I hope there's some questions.
Do we have any questions for Richard? Oh, go ahead, Terry.
Yes, Richard, thank you for being here. I have a couple of questions. It seems like a lot of the statistics that you showed us today seems that we have many unprepared students with unrealistic expectations, and that what we seem to be now expected to do is to fix these shortcomings that these students bring to us, rather than pointing out to the prior educational institution that they're sending us a substandard student in the larger picture. I mean, obviously, yes, there's the top students and everything, but they're sending us these people, and we're not holding them as an institution to task to send us prepared people. Instead, we get large number of unprepared people, and now we have to suddenly change what we're doing to fix the shortcomings that the lack of professionalism of the people that preceded us have in setting us a viable student.
Well, the one thing I would say, the colleges, for instance, have something called the college math project. So what they found over the years was that students were coming in that didn't have what they felt was needed to be successful in their courses. So what they did is they brought together college math instructors or instructors in related fields with K-12, with Ministry of Education and high school teachers. And what they've done is they've mapped the curriculum. So they've had a clear discussion about this is what we need at college, for instance. And then they've looked at how does the primary and secondary system teach it, when do they teach it, and are there any gaps? There are constructive ways like that that I think could be undertaken. The other reaction I would make is we can't get into the game of finger pointing because, I mean, we can blame our own colleagues. I've had cases where I was teaching an honors course and I was appalled at the lack, not only of the skills, but the lack of understanding of how poor their skills were. And I could have pointed the fingers at my colleagues from previous years as well. Plagiarism that I caught in fourth year, that I'm sure they were not doing for the first time, that was never caught before. What I would say is this, even if I teach contract, and most of you know contract teaching doesn't pay very well, but I take my responsibility seriously. If I'm hired by a post-secondary institution to teach a course, that group of students in front of me is my responsibility. I may not like it. I may not like their skill sets. I may not like that they got admitted with low skill sets, but it is now my responsibility to do the best I can in the time I have allotted to me to improve those skills rather than simply give up. Partly because there are students in that group who are high achievers, who do want to go on. So I think I agree, we've got to talk more broadly, but we've also got to turn that responsibility back to ourselves as well, as individual teachers.
I'd just like to respond to that, please, because I also noticed in some of your statistics, somebody who was a secondary school teacher for a long time ago in the United Kingdom. I'm a bit puzzled by some of these mismatches between public reporting and Canada's education system, which is a PISA test.
Yep. Yeah.
And then the statistical information that says that the vast number of kids who come to universities and colleges are prepared.
Yeah.
Now, I think that the percentage of kids are coming to public schools from lack of professionalism when therefore in one of the top education systems in the world, with a demanding and challenging job. They're also working with a large number of kids who arrive as second language English speakers. So it's not really surprising that they're not writing in perfect academic English at the age of 18. But one of the big problems, and I'm a researcher in education myself, has always been that the education system is geared to what universities require. And the problem of accessing post-secondary education has been for a lot of kids to jump the barrier to what universities require. Perhaps we should be looking at where our entering students are starting from and working out how we can move them to where we want them to be in that first year, rather than continually saying, yes, teachers, you're better, but the children you're sending or the young people you're sending to us don't meet the grade, I'm sorry. I think that we have to look very hard at what our starting expectations are.
Yeah. And the other challenge is if you're going to do those kinds of measures because you know that students are not as prepared and you want to particularly target help at those students who need it the most, where do you find the resources for that? Because this is not something that's covered generally in the grants that currently go to institutions. It's costly, especially if you make it compulsory and so large numbers of students are required to take some sort of skills grading course or something. It's a discussion we need to have, and in fact we have a paper on literacy coming out this fall that focuses just on that literacy issue. And the fact that many universities in Ontario actually used to have an entrance evaluation of students. Waterloo is about the only major university that still has something like that. I know Huron University College has a program as well, but as a major institution, it's the only university. And even in the colleges, only about 2/3 do some sort of entry assessment. The question is, what's the use of doing it if you don't have the resources to commit to helping them? Then all it's doing is giving you a diagnostic tool. Yeah. Yeah.
My favorite comment was the student who told me that the Persians invaded Greece via the Baltic Sea. my question is, how do we bring into some sort of understanding of their problem the strategic students? Because it seems to me that as you went through your talk, the statistics prove more and more that the strategic students are going to do really badly in the job world. We're telling me that their printer broke down or their cat died or whatever it is that they can't handle their work. It's not going to cut it in the job world. So even if they get a job, they're going to lose it. How do we handle these students and not enable them to go on being strategic?
My own opinion is we have to have a broader, for instance, the recruiters who I met with last week were asking if they could use parts of my presentation when they meet with parents. Because there are parents that they will be meeting this year with kids in grade 11 or 12 who are planning to send their young daughters and sons off to university and college shortly. And they want to have better data to say to them, it's not just the degree. Don't just think it's going to the right university and the right program. There are other factors. I think we've got to do it with parents. I think we have to do it with students before they arrive. We have to do it when they arrive as well. It really worries me because on the job side, for instance, I've seen a number of applications from people in their mid-20s with credentials and no work experience at all. No part-time jobs, no summer jobs. I can tell you why they're going to have a tough problem finding a job. And it has nothing to do with their credential. As an employer, I'm not going to take a risk on a student with a credential and no work experience. But we're not telling people that. I don't think young people are hearing this. So young people now, they finish a year of university and they go for vacation. Well, you know, I try to tell them, you know, that's probably not the most strategic thing to do. It's great to go on a vacation and have fun. But if you end up not having work experience either, even an A grade average, even the highest GPA with a credential, you're going to have a tough time finding a job because you don't have networks, you haven't done interviews before. So we have to have a broader education about what gets a job, what gets a career. It isn't even just your grades either. It is all those other things as well.
If we need to adapt and innovate in terms of dealing with these students, doesn't the job market have to a certain extent also recognize that we're not going to be able in 4 years to fix some of these issues?
Mm-hmm.
So these issues are going to continue into the job market. So what's your comment on that?
Well, I mean, I have heard stories where now jobs that used to require, that didn't require university, now require maybe university and maybe even masters, that they're still sometimes using that extra credential as some kind of a check that they have the skills that are needed. I still tend to think that most employers are looking for proof in a way that makes sense to them of your ability. And I'll tell you, once you're in the workforce, and I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about this, once you're in the workforce for 2 or 3 years, they don't even look at your credential. Like maybe later on for promotion or something like that, but then it's about what you can do. What matters to an employer is, can you show up? Can you work with other people? Do you have a good work ethic? Do you pay attention to detail? And I can go on and on. Can you write? If after 6 months you can't establish that, you know, you have a probation period, they probably won't maintain their job. If after 2 years they're doing it consistently and they have references that are able to show that, the degree at that point is really less important, far less important. Yeah.
And skills that can acquire while they're learning that will be important to get a job. My question is, where are the people and how can we communicate to the public in general, and particularly the government that's supposed to represent the government, that's supposed to represent the people, that this this notion of a job itself needs to be redefined in our contemporary world. It has been redefined materially, cognitively, technically, and so on. The simple fact of the matter is that the nature of labor is changing so much, has changed so much, that not everyone who has skills, who has the achievement, and so on, will get a job. They're certainly not the kind of job that they think they should get on the basis of the work that they've given so far. In other words, everyone's talking to universities
Yes.
and colleges and high schools about what we have
Yeah.
to do in order to prepare our students for the job market. Who is communicating about, who's doing the analysis of this job market and telling the truths about that? I'm tired of being attacked for not giving students a voucher for a job. It doesn't exist.
Honestly, we have a paper coming out this fall. We're finishing writing it right now, called Work and Learning. And it's about the fact that always many people have been mixing work and learning, going back to high school. I was a yearbook editor, I had part-time jobs, I had summer jobs. I had more work experience on and extracurricular on my CV going into university than many people today in their 20s coming out of 1 or 2 degrees. Why did I do well in the labor market? I think in part because of that. That work experience, all those things, first of all, it gives you a hunger to go to university. There's nothing like working a shift work at a factory or working farm labor to make you want to go. There's nothing like earning so many dollars an hour, knowing what that takes to earn, to make sure you use your books you buy and make sure you show up for your classes. And I'm old school. You can tell I'm old school, but I don't think it's a bad thing for people to have some work experience earlier on in life, because it also gives them a sense of the reality of the labor market. If you've never seen the labor market and you've never experienced it and you've never been part of it and you've never worked with other people who are 20 years older than you to see the alternative pathways, then how do you know what to expect? So I think there's a broader education that needs to happen. Our paper hopefully will get to a little bit of that there are a whole host of things and not just the credential. In fact, some of these statistics will be used in that paper as well.
I'm going to actually invite us to go and have a break, but I want you to join me in thanking. Richard will be around for the day. Thank him again.
Thank you very much.